Hi.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi, Dennis.
Hello.
We can hear you. You can hear us.
Yes, I can hear.
Can you hear us, Dennis?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me share the screen and we can get started.
Kent. Hi, Kent.
Hi, guys. Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Okay, welcome everyone. You should be able to see the text on your screen now. It's a short chapter, and here we come to the final mitzvah that was that's mentioned in the open to this chapter, which is the mitzvah of lo tachtom shor b'disha, that one is not allowed to muzzle an animal while it's working for you. So we're going to discuss those details of this particular mitzvah. Okay, let's begin. First halacha, and with this we conclude the chapter on Sechirut, the chapter on the laws associated with hiring. So halacha 1, an animal should be given the opportunity to eat whenever it works with produce, whether the produce is still attached to the ground or has been harvested. Similarly, it may partake of produce from the burden it is carrying until it has been unloaded. So if you got it schlepping stuff, it can eat from that if it turns its head around, provided that the person caring for the animal does not take the produce in his hand and feed it. So you have to allow the animal that's working with food to eat from it, but the person, if there is a person who is guiding the animal, they cannot take the food and feed it directly. Whoever prevents an animal from eating while it is working should be punished by lashes. As it says, do not muzzle an ox while threshing. So this is the broad prohibition, is if you prevent it from eating in any way, really, any animal. So he explains, this prohibition applies to an ox and to all other species of animals and beasts, whether kosher animal or non-kosher animal. So it's not specifically the ox, that's just the common example. Similarly, it applies with regard to threshing and all types of work with produce. So although the pasuk refers to an animal while it's threshing, but threshing, by the way, just to clarify, is if the animal would pull something heavy to crush the grain so that it would separate, so that then they would be able to separate the grain from the chaff. So it's in that activity or any other activity that brings the animal in direct contact, as it were, with the food that it would otherwise can eat. Similarly, it applies with regard to threshing and all types of work with produce. The Torah speaks about an ox threshing only to mention the most common instance. Okay? An employer is not liable if he muzzles a worker. It sounds a little bit funny because we've had a separate mitzvah already, which we learned about, that a hired worker, you have to allow them to eat in the course of their work as well, right? So you have a positive mitzvah to allow them. But this particular prohibition is a prohibition on animals, not a human being. So if you did it, of course, you can't do that, but that's not the specific mitzvah in the Torah. And therefore, he wouldn't get lashes for it because you wouldn't be transgressing a biblical prohibition. But it's certainly not something you can do. He is liable for muzzling an animal, right? If you muzzle an animal, then you are transgressing this particular prohibition, which means that you get the relevant punishment, which is lashes. This applies whether he muzzled the animal while he is working with it or muzzled it before and then works with it while muzzled. He is liable even if he muzzled it with his mouth. What does muzzled it with his mouth mean? That means if you shout at the animal every time it tries to take food, so you scare it off the food. So in effect, you're not allowing it to eat while it's busy working. So again, the point is whether you muzzle it, even though it says you muzzle it while it's threshing, the prohibition is the same as if you muzzled it in preparation to bring it to the threshing floor, same prohibition. And similarly, you don't have to actually physically put a muzzle over the animal's mouth. But if you prevent it from eating by shouting, that would also be the same prohibition. When a person rents an animal, muzzles it, and then threshes with it, he receives lashes and must pay the owners the value of 4 carbon of grain for a cow and 3 carbon for a donkey. So interesting, right? If you hire the animal, you're not allowed to muzzle it. That's your prohibition. Now, there's also an expectation that a cow or a donkey will eat a certain amount. You didn't allow it to eat while it was working. That's one prohibition, you get lashes. you also now got to pay the owner the amount of food it would have eaten or could have eaten in that time. Okay? And now the Rambam has to explain this, because usually in an instance where you get lashes, you don't have to pay. So what he's going to clarify now is that over here you're talking about two different frameworks of responsibility that begin at two different times, and therefore it's not a punishment for the same act, where the rule applies that if you get lashes, you don't pay. Okay, so he has to explain that this is two distinct responsibilities here. So he says, although generally a person does not receive both lashes and a financial penalty for the same transgression, an exception is made in this instance. Why? Because the renter is obligated to provide for the animal with its sustenance from the time he took it, as part of the rental deal, right? And he is not liable for the lashes until he threshes with that animal while muzzled. So that's an activity that's going to take place later, because it's two different frameworks, really. And one begins as soon as you take responsibility for an animal. The other begins when you put the animal to work. Therefore, this individual will be liable to both punishments: lashes for transgressing the biblical command not to muzzle the animal, and the responsibility to repay the owner of the animal for not having allowed it to eat what was due to it. Halacha 3. When a Jew threshes with a cow belonging to a Gentile, he is subject to violating the prohibition against muzzling, right? Because it's about care for the animal. When by contrast a Gentile threshes with an ox belonging to a Jew, he's not subject to violating this prohibition because it's a mitzvah in the Torah. Obviously, the Rambam is not suggesting that that's advisable, but he wouldn't fall under that particular prohibition. If a Jew tells a Gentile, so a guy might come up with a chap, you tell your Gentile worker, muzzle the animal for me. Can't do that. If a Jew tells a Gentile, muzzle my ox and thresh with it, or if a thorn became lodged in the ox's mouth and he threshes with it so it doesn't eat, or he placed the lion outside the threshing floor, meaning is to put fear in the animal that it will be afraid to eat, or he places the animal's son outside the threshing floor so it's distracted, won't eat, he does not, or he doesn't provide the animal with a drink when it's thirsty and therefore it's not going to eat, or spreads a hide over the grain so that the threshing will still happen, but the animal doesn't have access to it. All of these and similar acts are forbidden, but the person does not receive lashes. In other words, what he's saying, it's like this is a rabbinic prohibition, which means in practice you can't do it, but it doesn't bear the responsibility of a biblical prohibition, and therefore one wouldn't get the punishment, although one is not allowed to do it. Okay, so all these instances, what are you doing? You're trying to skirt the specific prohibition. Rabbis say, no, that's not allowed. But of course, it's not the biblical prohibition, so you don't get lashes. When the produce with which the animal is working is bad for its digestion and will damage the animal's health, or when the animal is sick and eating will cause it to become diuretic, it is permitted to prevent the animal from eating. Because again, the basics of EI is that you're not allowed to, the underlying concept of EI is that you can't harm the animal by not allowing it to eat. But if eating is going to harm the animal, then you're doing it to protect the animal. So that would be okay, because the rationale is that the Torah acts as prohibition so that the animal would benefit. In such an instance, the animal does not benefit. Halacha 4. When a priest, meaning a kohen, is threshing grain that is truma, or grain that is definitely trumat ma'aseh, with a cow that belongs to an Israelite, he is not subject to violating the prohibition against muzzling them. Basically like this. There's certain foods that are holy. Only a kohen is allowed to eat it. What type of animals are allowed to eat from that holy food? Only a kohen's animal. So an Israelite's animal is not allowed to eat from that food. Because there's a prohibition for that animal to eat from that food, the kohen who's using it can muzzle it. Right? Because it's preventing the animal from doing something that's not allowed. This also applies when the cows thresh grain that is ma'aser sheni. So this is, right, again, ma'aser sheni was the 10th that is set aside for the owner to eat up in Jerusalem and has certain sanctity, right? So an animal is not allowed to eat from that outside of Jerusalem, just like the person can't. So therefore, that would, and when cows veer from the pot, nevertheless, because of the impression that it might create, when the cows are threshing grain that is a truma or ma'aser sheni, the worker should bring that type of grain and place it in the food sack, hanging below their mouths. So what he's saying is like this: all these types of food, that animal is not allowed to eat. And therefore, if someone who's managing that animal were to muzzle it, they are not transgressing the prohibition against muzzling the animal while it works. But because it's not obvious to the an observer that the grain that is being threshed has some type of unique quality, you can't tell the difference by looking at one heap of grain that it's Meiser Sheni or Truma or whatever it is. Therefore, you want to bring some other grain of the same type and put it in a food bag in front of the animal so the animal can eat from it during that time. So that you don't see an animal that is muzzled while it's doing work that otherwise it shouldn't be muzzled for. Halacha 5, when a person muzzles a cow that is threshing produce that is Meiser Sheni, which is Demai Trumas Meiser, which is Demai, or produce that grew from Truma, he violates the prohibition against muzzling the animal. Okay, so in this halacha, what the Rambam is referring to is certain types of food that are in doubt, or there's a prohibition extended to it for people. So, for example, demai. What's demai? Demai is a pile of food where you don't know if the correct meiser was taken or not. So, a person is not allowed to eat from it because of that doubt. But that prohibition doesn't extend to an animal. Or, for example, truma is prohibited to a person other than a kohen. If you took truma and you grew produce from it, that would be prohibited to another person, not a kohen, but not to animals, because it's an extension of the essential prohibition. And therefore, if the animal was thrashing foods of these categories, then you cannot muzzle the animal, and a person who does so would be liable, even though they themselves can't eat from that grain. Halacha 6. The owner of an ox is permitted to make his animal hungry and grieve it so that it will eat a large quantity of grain that it is threshing. Okay? Conversely, so you're renting it out. You know you're going to rent it out. So you're allowed to hold back on some of its food so it will eat heartily when it goes to do its work. Can do that. Conversely, the renter of the ox may feed it hay so that it will not eat large quantities of the grain that is threshing, which is obviously a higher value and higher quality. So feed it the most basic food, he can do that. Similarly, an employer may provide his workers with wine so that they will not eat many grapes. Conversely, the workers may dip their bread in brine so they will eat many grapes. Obviously, the brine makes them, I guess, it's salty, it's thirsty, and they'll drink more, or they'll eat more of the grapes. That's fine, because as long as they're doing it in the course of their work, as we've learned, they can do that. A worker may not, however, and this is very interesting and important. A worker may not, however, perform work at night and then hire himself out during the day, or work with his ox in the evening and then rent it out in the morning. Similarly, he should not starve and aggrieve himself and give his food to his sons, because this leads to stealing from the work due of his employer. Why? How are you stealing? Because his energy will be sapped and his thinking will be unclear, and he will not be able to perform his work robustly. So it's not so innocent to stay up late watching Netflix or whatever people do these days, and then come to work and you're not in your prime capacity. Okay, and he emphasizes this further in Halacha 7. Just as an employer is warned not to steal wages from the poor person or to withhold it from him, meaning his employee. Similarly, the poor person, the employee, is forewarned not to steal from the work due to his employer and neglect his work slightly here and there, spending the entire day in deceit. Don't come to work with an attitude that, I'm trying to get away with whatever I can get away with. You're going to come to work with a commitment to using all your time. That's the quantity of commitment that you need to give. Instead, he's obligated to be precise with regard to his time. The importance of such preciseness is indicated by our Seder's ruling that workers should not recite the fourth blessing of grace so as not to neglect their work. This is in the laws of Birkat HaMazon, because it's the fourth blessing is an additional blessing and not part of the biblical requirement to say the grace after meals. If you're an employee and it's going to rob your time that you owe to the employer, you don't say that fourth blessing. Okay, that's how much time we've got to be careful about. So quantity, you've got to give everything that you've been hired for, you got to give if your work is based on hours, right? Similarly, a worker is obligated to work with all his strength. Not only have to be there committed for the entire time that you're hired for, but you've got to be committed with everything that you have. And we learn this for Jacob, the righteous man said, right, we learned this in this week's parasha or next week. Yaakov reflecting on his time that he worked for love, and he said, I served your father with all my strength. Therefore, he was granted a reward, even in this world, as indicated And the verse says, and the man became prodigiously wealthy. This was Yaakov for all the work that he put in. Because when you do what's right in law, what the Rambam is intimating, then Hashem blesses you not only in the world to come, but in this world as well. And with this, we end this chapter, and we end this with this particular halacha and this section. Okay, let's go into the questions. Does an animal get to eat from the load it is carrying? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Right? It's carrying a load, it's working with food, and it's allowed to eat from it. Does the prohibition against muzzling an animal while it works apply to non-kosher animals?
Yes.
Yes.
It does. Okay. True or false? When a Jew threshes with a cow belonging to a Gentile, there's no prohibition against muzzling.
False.
False, right? It's a mitzvah on a Jew, and even if it's a non-Jew's animal. And fourth question, from who do we learn that an employee must work with all of his strength? Joseph, King David, or Jacob?
Jacob.
And as we said, it's timely because the story is in our current parsha. Okay, beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Another chapter
Thank
down, another section,
Cheers,
and we'll see you
bye.
next week.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Hopefully everyone have a beautiful day.
everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.
But the Rambam doesn't give a little drosha at the end of the chapter. So
Understand?
the Rambam normally at the end of a chapter normally gives a bit of a spiel, a little drosha.
In a lachaim.
The Rambam at the end
The
of a
Rambam or the
chapter.
Rabbi?
Sorry,
The Rambam or the Rabbi?
no, the Rambam.
What are you
Isn't it?
what are you referring to?
On the Mishnah Torah at the end of a chapter. Doesn't the rabbi normally?
We said, blessed be he who grants assistance. You have that
okay.
sentence at the end of each chapter.
Yeah.
What do you
No,
reckon?
not that. But all right, that's fine.
You're not talking about the intro where he gives all the mitzvahs.
So what?
You're not, maybe you're referring to the intro that he gives before a new section.
No. Well, often, maybe not every time, but quite often he gives a little bit of a message at the end of a chapter. Not the normal blessing, not the normal bracha, but that he was. No? Well, maybe.
Not so regularly. No, it would be unusual.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Okay, so
No worries.
anyway, hold to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.